Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining TDS and DampSmart for our webinar on managing damp and mould in rental properties. I can see that some of you have been with us for a little while already, so you will have had an opportunity to read the pointers on the slide. However, just very briefly for those that have just joined, do ask questions using the questions button in the session, and we will answer as many of your questions as we can. I can see already that we have some, which is great. Do make notes if you wish by clicking the icon, which shows a piece of paper and a pencil, and then you'll be able to send your notes to your email address at the end. And if you do have internet or connectivity issues, please try to refresh your web page in the first instance. And if this doesn't work, please close the webinar in your internet browser, click back to your session reminder email to completely refresh your connection. So with us today is Leonard Carey from DampSmart. My name is Sandy Baston, Director of Resolution at TDS, and we have also Martin Wilkes, Adjudicator. So let's make a start. So I'm going to hand over now to Leonard.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Leonard Carey. So I'm the founder of DampSmart. My background is in science, but also in software. A lot of my background has been with mobile networks, with Orange and AT&T globally. But latterly, for the last few years, been working with universities, with charities, with landlords, with councils, just to answer a simple question around damp and mould, but answer it not just to say, what the problem is, but also to say, well, is it a fabric problem or is it a habit problem or both? And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this is because, and like yourselves, you're probably coming up against it every single day where there's a mold issue and you've got no idea whether it's anything to do with the fans, whether it's to do with the windows, the heating, or whether it's to do with the things that we as people, human beings, do. Because as you know, even as you're breathing at night, we let out moisture, but depending on where that moisture lands, will then create a really good location for mold to grow. What I wanted to do is find a way to take all the science of how buildings perform, but also understand how some of the challenges of landlords, but also tenants, and put it all together so we can answer those questions very simply. So it makes it so that complaints go down, but also, people can live in decent homes. But most recently, though, because of the renters' rights bill, but also AWAB's law and with energy efficiency legislation coming up as well, there's more and more of an imperative really to get to the nub of the problem very quickly and then plan a response. And that response, you've got to be able to prove that it's actually fixed the problem. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of those real world examples where we've been using our data combined with some really good landlords and also some of the charitable sector as well, to look at the problem slightly differently. Yes, using data to absolutely isolate what the problem is, but then finding a way to be able to say the landlord, they're capable and able to do this, and the tenant is capable and able to do that, and coming up with that agreement to then hopefully reduce the amount of disputes. Just keeping on this slide here, Investigate Plan Actions Act. I think the renters or the AWAB's law has put some very clear defined time periods where you've got to investigate a problem and plan what you've got to do and then act on those. But what we've discovered by working with landlords, councils and others over the years is that to actually come up with an action plan, you've got to know what the problem is in the first place. And those problems can be quite varied. And what we've discovered and what our technology does is we can understand exactly what is going on with the fabric of the building, what's actually going on with when I say fabric of the building, I mean walls and windows, whether those walls are a cold bridge. And forgive me if I say anything that's a little bit geeky, sciencey, but anybody on the call who wants to have a bit of a deep dive on the geeky science stuff, more than happy to have a chat with you. But there are things about the fabric of the building which either make it quite a high risk property for the walls being cold, and any moisture will then condense on that wall or on the windows, or where the fans aren't set correctly. We've been working with some fan providers, and they were telling us some stories around how they're installed, but at the sort of standard factory setting, which isn't enough given the property. But there's a whole raft of different factors that can determine what the root cause is. And what we do is find out through measuring, through measuring, and there's a little bit of observation and talking to the tenants exactly what is going on. And therefore, from that, you can then make a decision what you're going to do first. And in this talk, I will talk about one specific example that we did in an HMO. That HMO was quite, it's an example of the whole story where some parts of the property were poorly insulated, some rooms where they had showers and weren't closing the doors, some occupants that were working from home. So it's quite a good example of all the different issues that probably a lot of you come across in your various different properties. And I'll come on to that a little later. But I think this slide here, it is about how do you make sure that you can have a plan of action. And once you've got that plan of action, you can then demonstrate that that you're compliant, you've done the job. If you go to the next slide. And sorry, forgive me for my sore throat, but I don't know if any of you are England or Scottish fans, but watching the rugby on Sunday or Saturday, wasn't great. A lot of shouting, a lot of almost heart attacks. But so yeah, hopefully my throat stays out. So just following on from this idea of understanding exactly what's going on in the property. Yes, I know that we call it fabric and habit. We call it understanding what's going on with the fabric of the building or the habits of the people or the things that are going on. Yes, you can replace habit with lifestyle. I know sometimes it's difficult to say that without feeling, but sometimes it's not just about a lifestyle thing. It's also about the things that you're used to. I have arguments still with my wife about opening windows in the house. We all do. We say, no, the heat's going to go out if you do that. But that's learned behavior. When I cook rice, I put the lid on. But my mum, she doesn't, because of learned behavior. But the thing is about damp and mold is that if you've got a checklist, or if you've got your protocol list of when you go into a property to determine what is actually going on in that house, only 20% of it you can actually see. And that 20%, you can do an external view of the gutters. Yeah, you can see if they're broken, whether they're disconnected from the hopper. You can see where there's vegetation in there. And that's instant. That's really easy to see that stuff. And you can then see the water coming down the wall. And you can make some inferences about, well, yeah, it's likely to be a problem there. But the other stuff is really hard to see. But you really, really need to understand it. Things like fans, people do switch them off. You need to know, have they switched them off? If the fans are on, how well are they performing? And what we do in our data is we actually can tell you how quickly does that fan get to two states. One is down to 65%. Is it within 2 hours, in 4 hours, in 6 hours? But also, does that fan extract enough moisture to prevent colder walls from getting condensation on them? Heating's a really big thing. We have actually had properties that are down to 12 degrees, but no mold, no damp. But they were cottages up in, I've got their one up the north somewhere where, but the windows are single glazed, and the pressure inside the house was equalized to what was going on outside. and there was a nice exchange of air. That was great. But we've had places that are 24 degrees and at 55% relative humidity, and there's mold everywhere, and the damp risk was huge. And it's one of those questions that we get asked over and over again: is 18 degrees okay, or is 55% relative humidity okay? And we say it depends. It depends on how much that building can then take or manage that moisture. Are the walls, as the insulation on the walls, on the next image, you've got insulation on the walls. The walls are really, really important. We've got one coach house at the moment, and if you can imagine a property where it's sitting over some garages. The garages are unheated. It's a 1990s, nearly 2000s property. It's got 3 exposed walls. The floors are absolutely cold, but the temperature inside is at 23, 24 degrees. But there is damp on the floor, especially in the corners, even though the relative humidity is at 55. But in that one, it's all about the insulation. Mold spores, again, we can see damp. We can see the black mold on loft hatches, on walls and corners and skirting boards. But the problem is, you don't know how they were caused. And more to the point, and the practicality of cleaning them. We're working with a company that has a HEPA filter, and what's really quite interesting is that you still need to remove the mold spores before you do the clean, because you can do all the cleaning, the mold spores are still there, and the mold spores will still land on any fresh water that's on condensation from the windows. So it's not as easy as just painting over things. And the windows are really, really, I think for a lot of landlords, if you've got in a conservation area or is it listed properties, single glazed windows, it's that debate around, well, actually, do I really put up the fight to get them double glazed or even triple glazed? Because would it make the difference? And again, by doing the calculations that we do, we can help understand, well, yes, it would make a difference. Given the amount of moisture, then you would avoid condensation on windows. But this 80% thing is quite important, because at the end of the day, if you can't see or you don't understand that 80%, you're not going to be able to plan, and you're not going to be able to avoid those disputes, because you're still going to be going round and round those circles that says, is it the fabric, is it the habit, so on and so forth. We can go on to the next slide. So we through the calculations, we make it simple to see and understand that 80%. I'm going to talk about the calculations for a bit. And this is where I get a little bit geeky, so please somebody get that little, I don't know, but there's a little cane that can take me off the stage. It's really, so we've taken a whole bunch of calculations that you typically would take to measure heat loss, for instance, in homes. And through measuring the heat loss, you can measure the U value of the walls, how susceptible those walls are going to be to condensation, where there's likely to be, some of you may come across, and hopefully I say it correctly, interstitial condensation. So maybe in the cavity where there's likely to be condensation in there. But also ventilation, the moisture profile, and through that moisture profile, we can then determine, is it better to dehumidify, take moisture out of the air, or is it better to just heat the air instead? And some of you may be aware of things like psychometric charts. Okay, so if you are a heating and ventilation engineer, you'll use those to make those decisions, that given the relative humidity or what you're trying to get to, are you going to heat the air or are you going to remove moisture? We do all those calculations. And the heating performance, that's a really important thing, because too often we've seen inspectors go around to a property and say, yeah, it was nice and toasty warm, it was great. But actually, that was on that day. And not only was it just toasty warm for just a couple of hours on that day, and they're there, When we then look at the data, or when we then measure the data, we can see when that heating does go up, whether it does go up enough, and whether it stays on for long enough as well to prevent the moisture from condensing. And there's some really interesting patterns that we start to see, or we have started to see, and the impact of that is for one landlord. When we showed them, we had them in different risks of this room. It's clear that there's no heating in there. There was a wall radiator, but the tenant wasn't using it. And so when we had the conversation, they said, look, I'm just a bit scared of switching it on because I think it's going to be too expensive. And so we worked out how much how expensive it would be. Mold risk is important. It's important to understand the severity of it and also the locations and times of day. One thing that we do is we put sensors in every single room, including hallways, lofts, basements as well. We look at the whole house, because if some of you may be aware that depending on the conditions in one room, as you open a door, whatever's happening in one room may actually have an effect on another. And I think I've used the example already, where if you've got a warm room above a very cold room, then the heat's going to go. It's like holding a mug of coffee, and the coffee's warm, but the heat's trying to get out. Yeah, so everything's trying to equalize. So we measure everything to see whether there are certain rooms that are affecting others, because in that way you can say, all right, actually it is the bathroom where the fan's not working correctly, where it is warm and the hallway is cold and the insulation is poor, that the vapor goes out and hits the hallway, and there you go, boom, it goes to a cold spot. But we are looking at health impacts as well, because we know that we're looking ahead into the future a bit, is that, yes, with renters' rights and with AWAB's law and others, we are actually doing some work in Leeds at the moment to look at particulate matter and volatile organic compounds and the impact on people's health, and trying to look at not only the mold and damp and the temperature, but also look at the particulates. And we're doing that also to see whether, if you do remove or use a HEPA filter, is there a way of getting the particulate matter at a reasonable World Health Authority level. Sorry, you go to the next slide. So I'm going to use this example of the HMO. I don't know whether Mike or Alona's on the call. If anybody knows them, they're pretty good landlords. They've got a property where it's an HMO, 3 floors, and we did some work with them about 6 months ago. And it's a really interesting example where in every bedroom there was a slightly different persona, different way of working, different understanding of what moisture and mold and damp and so on would have an effect. Some of them had an ensuite shower, some didn't. And I'll just go through a couple of them. One of them, working from home, ensuite shower. His habit was to go in the shower, open and close the door when he's having a shower, but then when he's finished, leave the door open. Now the wall was an external wall that didn't get much sun. It was going to be cold. We measured everything, and you could see in the data, as soon as that moisture came out of the shower, it just went straight to that wall. He was complaining that there was just water just coming down, and it's just moldy. And because he's working at the desk there and trying to create a business from home, it was just horrible. In that case, we could see what the problem was. And in that one, it was a case of saying, look, can you just see if you can close it's a change of habit, because he didn't understand. But once we talked it through with him, he understood, and he closed the window. Closed the door. And in fact, I think one of the openings to the window on that wall that was getting cold, you couldn't open it very far, and so I think Mike did open it, change that window so it could be opened a bit more to ventilate a bit more. In another bedroom, on the ground floor, there were three external walls. Three external walls. And on one of the walls, it just looked as if there was a leak somewhere. It looked as if there was just water coming down. In fact, actually, it was condensation, because the walls were just getting too cold. Yes, but also the temperature in the room was too low, and the moisture levels. When you looked at the volume of the room, it was just going to hit those walls. In that case, it was a case of either insulate the walls, improve them, but that's going to be just too difficult. You have to decant somebody. There's going to be a lot of work involved in that. Move the radiator to that wall to keep the wall a bit warmer. I think in the end, there's a combination of things that did around moving the radiator, but also dehumidifying as well. Other rooms, some good stories were, and this is really good to see that. I think at the front of the house, a big bay window, and there was an ensuite there. The tenant in there, she even had her own habit of, when she saw the glass in the bathroom become clear, that was the only time that she'd open the door. I thought, oh, great. And then she had no mold at all in that room at all. So she taught us something about, how people can, with some good habits, detect for themselves what to do about the right thing to do to avoid damp and mold. Sorry. I think the point here is there are the ways that we live, and the things that we know, and the things that we believe we know, and but you do need to measure everything. And what we try and do is, if you go to the next slide, what we try and do is, and I'll unashamedly just talk about these small little sensors. What we do is try and make getting to the answer really simple. And it's important that part of this is making sure with the sensors, they're just battery powered. You put them in each room. You don't need to screw them into walls or wire them in. Even the hub device, you just plug it in, green light comes on. It's how do you make it really super simple to get to the answers about everything around the house? Does the insulation, is the wall insulation act as a cold bridge? Is it part of the problem? And for that, all we do is have a sensor on the wall, and we can measure differences between the wall, the ambient, the outside, and then do some pretty good calculations to see, well, how much heat has been lost, and compare it to moisture levels and heat inside and outside. The amount of kilowatts is really important as well, because over and over again, we do see that a lot of the problem is that people just can't afford to heat their house. Simple as that. And so we do measure how many kilowatts is needed to keep the house at a steady 18 degrees. And you'll be surprised, really surprised, that what is noted as a EPC-C and D&E and so on, we've had places that were an EPC-B, newly renovated property, but when we measured the walls, they had an equivalent U value of 1.4, which is really bad. Had electric heating, but it was a warehouse type conversion. And those electric wall heaters had no impact whatsoever. They're only pumping out 1 kilowatt, but they needed about 6. But there's no way that at 6 kilowatts per hour, at a cost of 27p, there's no way that the tenant was going to afford it. It just wasn't going to happen. And so in that case, we got Green Doctors in their charitable organisation to get some vouchers for them, talk to the council, supplement their heating costs. And sure enough, when we went in there with the charity, the mould was not good. And it's just down to the heating. But it's more. But the thing that hopefully we're getting really good at is not just saying there's your problem, but actually saying, and these are the things you need to do to improve it. Increase your heating, give them some money, change that fan, have a conversation about opening the windows. We're not as far as going, because, you know, I'll tell you a quick little story. We in our house, we've got this box right in the corner in one of the bedrooms, right in the corner, and it's been there for months. Took the box away, and the wall's damp. And we go, oh my God, I can't believe I'm a culprit. But you know what, there are some algorithms that we're starting to build where we can start to look at, there may be a risk if you do have furniture in these positions, you know, remove them or move them away a bit. But right now we're not quite there yet. But where we are is at least to say the biggest culprit is temperature, moisture, fans, windows not being opened, because we can work out whether there's natural ventilation or not. And that's we believe it's a good starting point, just to help stop that it's your fault, no, it's your fault, and all the disputes that go with it. If I go into the next slide, and stop me if I need to, if I'm running out of time. Yeah, I think this is the last one. So I've already talked a little bit about you know, the small little sensors, but they are small and they are innocuous. We've deliberately designed them and deliberately designed the experience so it's not disruptive. Put them in for 14 days, and the 14 days, we came up with 14 days before the renters' rights guidelines came with the 14 days. So because with the analytics, you could quickly see a trend after about, say, 10 days. Because what we were seeing is that, and there are some anecdotal stories about once you put sensors in a house, the first few days, people do change the way they do things. But then after a few days, they then, I mean, I do it. You go back to your standard habit. So the 14 days kind of smoothed out those changes. But we make it so that in those 14 days, we're getting all the data around the walls, around the fans, around the moisture profiles, the heating profiles, whether there's natural ventilation or not, so that we can assess the risks, hopefully avoid disputes, but also go to the next stage, which is you can measure the improvements as well. Because at the end of this, when you actually have an action plan, if you are going to put a new radiator in place, if you are going to fix the cold bridge, yeah, it's difficult. There's one, we had a bit of a top floor flat, which is a really nice wraparound patio doors, I guess. But it was just a cold bridge. The sills were just a cold bridge into the rooms, and it's always getting condensation on those cold bridges. In that case, you couldn't change the windows. It would cost tens of thousands of pounds. So instead, look, you're going to have a bit of an educational thing with the tenants. You're going to have to close. We all had ensuite bath showers. Close the doors, but also have humidity sensor fans, I think they were. So they'll always be kicking in, and give them options. It's all about how do you give them options, how do you give everybody an option, and then how do you measure the success after that as well. And that's really important. How do you measure the success? I don't know what's on the next slide. Oh, I think that's the end. I think I just want to move over, hand over to Martin, because I think that last point around having success, but also avoiding dispute and making it clear about what the problem is and how to solve it, I think hopefully helps with what Martin and his team are doing as well.
Thanks very much, Leonard. Really informative. So we're just going to talk about damp and mould from an adjudicator's viewpoint. Just very briefly touching on landlords and tenants' responsibilities. So landlord is under Section 11 obliged to keep in repair the structure and exterior of the property, drains, gutters and external pipes, keeping in repair and proper working order the installations for the supply of water, gas and electricity, sanitation including basins, sinks, baths and sanitary conveniences, and keeping in repair and proper working order the installations for space heating and heating water. Tenants obviously have a responsibility to act in a tenant-like manner. They should complete minor maintenance and repair jobs, to report promptly disrepair or safety issues to their landlord, and to keep a record, a good audit trail of when and how the report was made and to whom. And importantly, if they are reporting issues or there are any problems, to allow access to the property for the landlord or their representative to complete repair works in a timely manner. So I think, as we've heard from Leonard, damp causes and lack of or failed damp-proof course, defective guttering, leaking roof, leaking pipes, condensation, usually poor ventilation, particularly in bathrooms, wet, damp clothing, drying, and the actual heating, whether the property is too warm or too cold. So I'm going to pass over now to Martin, who will run through the remainder of our presentation.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Martin. I'm one of the adjudicators at TDS. I've been adjudicating on tenancy deposit disputes for more than 10 years now. So I'm going to talk about it from an adjudicator's point of view. It's really interesting to hear Leonard talk there. Lots of stuff that I heard, which I think would be really useful for a landlord to understand what's going on in their properties. So top tips for a landlord then. A good starting point is to familiarise yourself with the government guidance that's been published, understanding and addressing the health risks of damp and mould in the home. Landlords should respond quickly and sensitively to reports of mould from the tenants and take a proactive approach in reducing the risk. This is going to reduce disputes, it's going to reduce cost, it's going to reduce the need to carry out repairs in the property, potential void periods and things like that. Regular property maintenance is the key, checking roofs, gutters, that 20% that Leonard talked about, the stuff that's visible, check that, get property managers to check it on their inspections. Improving ventilation, perhaps by installing trickle vents, extractor fans, and the right extractor fan, as we've heard from Leonard as well. Ensuring adequate airflow, upgrading insulation, perhaps, walls, windows, lofts, ensure they're well insulated to prevent those cold spots. And educating tenants, working with the tenants, educating them on how to prevent condensation from showering, from cooking, things like that. Again, knowledge that you might have to help that education. DampSmart is the key. Might just give you that information that you need to properly educate your tenants and work with them. Top tips for the tenants, though, as well, and I've read from the questions, we've got tenants and landlords here today. Ventilation is key. Opening windows regularly, ensure extractor fans are used for long enough. Sometimes they're connected to the light switch, and if there's no window and it's just the extractor fan and the tenant's finishing there and they turn the light off, what's going to happen to that moisture following showering? Sometimes the correct extractor fan perhaps isn't in there, but extractor fans should be run, certainly shouldn't be turned off with the isolator, which some tenants do. Heating and insulation, maintain constant and consistent temperature in the property. Reducing moisture by, don't dry clothes in the property unless you absolutely have to, keep that to a minimum. Moving furniture away from the walls as well to improve ventilation. These are good things that tenants can do. Crucially, report issues early. As soon as you spot the signs of mould and damp or a leak, report that to the agent or to the landlord so that they can investigate it. You can work together to determine what the cause is and prevent further damage. Cleaning and maintaining as well. Tenants should be wiping down condensation-prone areas to reduce the risk of mould forming. But the key is collaborative working. We say it all the time. Whenever we're looking at deposit disputes, the starting point really is to have that conversation, discuss things with the tenant, and it transfers all the way through the tenancy, really. If there are issues at the property, work closely together. It's a joint responsibility to ensure the home is kept dry and healthy, the responsibility of the landlord and the tenant. So good communication is essential. Tenants should feel able to make those reports and know that their reports are going to be listened to and investigated properly. Unfortunately, in the cases that I tend to see come through, the standard response is for the agent to just send them how to deal with damp in the property, and it'll just say open the windows more or turn the heating on. And as we've learned, that might not be the reason why we've got an issue with mold and damp. So it feels to the tenant like you're just transferring it back onto them. So good communication is essential, working together to act promptly. Prevention is always going to be better than the cure. Small actions can lead to costly repairs. And some useful resources are listed there. We've already mentioned that government guidance. It's a good read. It's not too long. Have a look at that. We've got the TDS website as well. It's a fantastic resource in our help centre. There's a guide on damp and mould, which is definitely worth a read. And then you can also look to other organisations such as RICS or the NRLA. Now, the general tenant obligation in relation to mould and damp is that, as Sandy said, the tenant has to act in a tenant-like manner. They have to do the little jobs about the place, the things that a reasonable tenant would be expected to do. And that's going to include wiping down condensation in the morning, making sure that the property is adequately ventilated, cleaning away small areas of mould as they develop, things like that. The tenant is also under an obligation under the tenancy agreement to report maintenance issues. So if the tenant doesn't report that maintenance issue and the problem becomes worse and the landlord ends up having to pay a lot more money than they would otherwise have, it then, in terms of the deposit dispute at the end of the tenancy and a claim that the landlord might wish to make, it doesn't really matter what the cause is so much anymore, because the tenant's breach is the failure to report. So the consequent damage as a result of that failure is something that the landlord is going to be entitled to compensation for. But tenants are required to make that maintenance report. And as with all matters that fall into dispute, we go through the adjudication process. An adjudicator will apply the same laws and rules that a court would, essentially. And so we have to think about the burden of proof. And this slide just illustrates that it is the tenant's deposit. It's their money. Even if you're holding it, it still belongs to the tenant. If you don't provide evidence to support the claim, then that deposit has to be returned back to the tenant. Similarly, if you don't provide sufficient evidence to prove your claim, then the deposit has to be returned back to the tenant. So we are always looking for evidence to support the claim. Inevitably, this is going to be the check-in and check-out report. Check-in report might show that the property was freshly painted with no mould, and then the checkout report might show that the walls are covered in black mold spores and there are run marks and drip marks. This is the sort of evidence that we're going to have to consider. But is that going to be enough? Well, it very much depends on the circumstances. So who's going to pay for the cost of these repairs then as a result of the mold and damage? As an adjudicator, I'm often being asked to determine this because I will have that check-in report which shows no mold or damp, and then a checkout report which shows quite an extensive problem. Now, if the mold and damp is relatively minor, if we're talking about mold spots around window reveals like in the photograph there, or maybe on a shower or bathroom ceiling, then on the face of it, on balance, that's probably because the tenant didn't ventilate the property well enough, didn't wipe away moisture, failed to do the reasonable things expected of a tenant. They didn't behave in that tenant-like manner. And that should be sufficient to demonstrate a breach, and the landlord will be entitled to recover their reasonable costs from the tenant's deposit to put those issues right. Those are relatively minor issues, and I don't think an adjudicator will have too many problems with that. But when we get to the really serious problems where we've got mold in other rooms, throughout the property, in hallways or in the corners of bedrooms and things like this, well, this might be indicative of other problems. And although there might not be an obvious cause, and we think back to Leonard's slide, we've got that 20% of the stuff that we might be able to see. We might not be able to see it, but 80% of it is stuff that we don't necessarily know about just by being in the property. And that might be the cause. It seems likely that that might be the cause. Condensation and mold is just as likely to be caused by one of those issues as it is the tenant's failure to adequately heat and ventilate the property in breach of the tenancy agreement. And the adjudicator's got to make that determination. They're being asked to, they're being invited to try and resolve this issue. So we often need a little bit more. And what adjudicators are often provided with, and what is really helpful, is a specialist report. This will give the adjudicator something to hang the hat on, to assist the adjudicator in determining what the problem is. Because that specialist report might be able to say things like, the ventilation was sufficient, or in their opinion, there was adequate ventilation, the extractor fans were all working, there was trickle vents, but at the time of the inspection, we noticed the tenant had 5 clothes racks full of soaking wet washing, and they hadn't opened the windows or whatever. The heating was whacked up to 30 degrees, something like this. These additional bits of evidence are going to be what's going to assist the adjudicator in making an award, because just based on that check in and check out, it's going to be very difficult for the adjudicator to find that the tenants are in breach there. So when we think about that specialist report, this really is the key to unlocking many of these disputes. In my experience, without a specialist report for a very serious mould problem, the claim is unlikely to succeed. We need that bit of extra. So what should a specialist report look like? Well, when we say specialist report, the contractor producing that report must be suitably qualified and experienced. It's got to have credibility and reliability to it as evidence. It's not going to be enough because your friend's a builder, or they've provided a email or something, or a cleaning company has done the same. We sometimes see that. It has to be a contractor that has the standing to make this determination. It has to be suitably independent as well. It's not the contractor, the cleaning contractor, that's going in and they're being paid for an end of tenancy clean and they're offering their thoughts on how this mould might have been caused. They're not suitably independent. So that's something else that we look for. If repairs or improvements are recommended as part of that report, because often these damp companies will sell you these passive ventilation systems and whatever, if they're making recommendations, well, this is an indication perhaps that the ventilation isn't quite as it should be, and perhaps improvements are required to prevent the issue from occurring. In those cases, it's going to be very difficult for the adjudicator to pin fault on the tenant again. How can we say the tenant is in breach of the property if a contractor is saying that actually it needs better ventilation? It should also include evidence-based findings and not just be mere opinion. We see again, building companies might offer an opinion. They might have experience. They might be in a decent position to offer that experience, that knowledge and experience. But on the face of it, objectively, dealing with it on the papers, is it going to be sufficient? Probably not. It should provide a clear conclusion as well that's going to allow the adjudicator to determine on balance where responsibility for this issue lies. If it just leaves it open-ended, or if it says, it could be a combination of things, again, it's going to be very difficult for us to say it's the tenant's fault. We're going to need some form of conclusion where the adjudicator can reliably say, on balance, this seems to be because the tenants failed to open the windows for long enough, run the heating for long enough, and were regularly drying clothes in the property. So by way of a quick case study here, just to kind of highlight these issues, to exemplify these issues that we've talked about, we've got a hypothetical landlord's claim here. They're claiming the cost to redecorate the bathroom at the end of the tenancy because the walls and ceilings are covered in mould. To support the claim, the landlord's provided a copy of the tenancy agreement because we always require that. We need to see what the contractual terms are. It will inevitably contain a clause saying the tenant must adequately heat and ventilate the property. We've got a check-in report and a check-out report, and we've got an invoice for the cost of the remedial works. The tenant's response to this claim is they dispute it. They say it's not our fault. They say they reported many months previously that the extractor fan in the bathroom had stopped working. Despite chasing that several times, the extractor fan was never fixed. So the adjudicator is being asked to make a decision on this evidence that they've had presented. Clearly, there was an issue with mould in the bathroom, but was it caused by the tenant's breach? Well, the tenancy agreement sets out the landlord and the tenant's obligations. The checkout report that should be the check-in report, shows there were no signs of mould at the start of the tenancy, but the checkout report supported this significant mould problem. The tenants provided evidence that they had reported the issue with the extractor fan in line with their contractual obligations. And they did this many months before the end of the tenancy. Sometimes tenants make the report right at the end. They make it literally in the week before they vacate. And sometimes that's just a little bit suspicious, but this report has been made months before the end of the tenancy. Given that the landlord was placed on notice for the need to repair the extractor fan and no remedial works were carried out, it would be unreasonable for the adjudicator to consider an award. Clearly, on the face of it, this issue in this bathroom has been caused because the extractor fan failed and the landlord didn't repair it. That seems to be the cause.
Thanks very much, Martin, there. So we do have questions that have been coming in. So thank you very much for that. Just quickly, though, had the landlord acted in a timely manner in that case study, the outcome would have been perhaps somewhat different?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if the landlord responded, the tenants say, oh, the extractor fan stopped working, the landlord goes out and fixes it, and it's fixed within a week or so, and we've got a couple of year-long tenancy, and we get to the end, and the bathroom is really covered in mold. Because this is the bathroom where we know it's high moisture from showering and bathing, the chances are this is because that extractor fan wasn't run for long enough. The tenant turned it off because they didn't like the noise. They closed the door and turned the light off or whatever, this sort of thing. It seems like the tenants really didn't act in a tenant-like manner, and the outcome probably would have been different, yeah.
So we have a couple of questions, many actually. Do you need professional check-in and check-out reports?
Well, no. I mean, really, when an adjudicator says check in and check out reports, I always say this whenever I speak to members or deliver training. What the adjudicator is looking for is evidence of condition and cleanliness at the start and the end of the tenancy. Now, best practice would say produce a professional, independent, written check in and check out report with supporting images, ideally signed by the tenant. But sometimes you don't always have that. What the adjudicator will look for is evidence of condition and cleanliness. And as long as it's reliable evidence, the adjudicator can do their job. The issue is that a professional report often is comprehensive. They use the appropriate software. They've got that investment in training and technology, and they can produce that comprehensive report. If it's not done professionally, sometimes things are missed. That can obviously have an impact at the end of the tenancy because we never really know what's going to fall into dispute.
Thank you. Just to answer a few questions that have been coming in, yes, we will be providing copies of the slide deck, and they will also be uploaded to YouTube. And next question, and there are guides obviously available, which I think Martin covered in the presentation itself. Leonard, portable sensors, which parameters are being monitored?
Yeah, so it's very simple. It's temperature and humidity. In our other one, we're actually doing particulate matter and VOC and NOx, but in the mold and damp and the insulation and heating and so on, it's temperature and humidity. It may sound simple, but behind all that, there's a whole bunch of mathematics and machine learning that we've creating these equations and these other processes to actually then turn that data into volumes of moisture. So we can calculate, independent of temperature, how much moisture is actually in the air, for instance. And given that we know what the volume of moisture is, because we've also calculated through those equations the insulation performance and the cold bridge of the wall, we can then detect, well, actually, given that volume, where is it likely to settle and turn into condensation? So yeah, so the parameters are very simple. But underneath it is an awful lot of maths that we've done over the last 4 years with a whole bunch of PhD students and a lot of insight from construction engineers as well.
Thank you. So Nikita, I think we've answered your question. When you first started renting, your extractor fan was unplugged. You plugged it in and turned it on and it didn't work at all. Should you raise this with your landlord to get it fixed? Absolutely, do get it raised, report it and keep a record of reporting it. And hopefully once it's fixed, that should sort that for you. Leonard, what can you do with tenants who have thick floor-to-ceiling curtains in front of all doors and windows, lots of house plants and lots of clutter in the property? Trickle vents have been added to the windows and dehumidifiers have been provided. I suppose that's just, an educational piece as well and habits.
Yeah, We had the one thing about data, and what we spend a long time doing, is how do you present the data so that everybody understands it, whether it be the tenant or the landlord. Because if you show a graph to some people, they just think, graph, what the hell's that about? But we're starting to perfect, and we have, how do you communicate to somebody, look, I know you've got it looking like this, your house has got that, and so on and so forth, but this is what the effect is. People get it. We actually had, we did about 2 years ago, we experimented with different user interface or different ways of reporting. We had one guy who kept his house at 26 degrees because he just liked it that way. But he saw this report as a very simple, it's like a diary of heat squares. And he didn't even call us. He didn't even call the landlord. We just, the next day when we gave him the report, we just saw the heating go off, not off, but down, because he got it. So, in answer to that question about what do you say to the person with long curtains and so on and so forth, it is about how do you have a conversation that says, look, this is what's happening to the house, and this is what could happen if these circumstances were slightly different. And this is what we try and do as well, is tell you what the situation is now, but then extrapolate, model what the conditions could be if it was changed. And that then opens up the dialogue, opens up the conversation.
Thanks very much, Leonard. I think that, Craig, probably answers your question also. Damp has caused paint cracks and flakes. What should be done now? I think that could be either Leonard or Martin.
I think I'm not construction. I'm not a surveyor, but are we saying that there's a wall that is quite wet and the paint is just peeling off? Is that what?
I think so. Yes. Yeah. But we see that often, actually, don't we, Martin? In
we do, in
disputes.
Yeah, and it's funny because, like Leonard says, he says, I'm not a surveyor. Well, I'm not a surveyor either, but I'm being asked to make a determination on these cases. And so I rely on the evidence that is sent in and presented before me. Now, if there is cracking and flaking to paint, it might have been caused by moisture, but it might also be because those walls weren't prepared properly. And maybe the paint has just started to flake off and peel. Maybe the decor was more than 5 years old. It depends very much on the circumstances. And the evidence that's provided before the adjudication, before they can make a determination. Yeah. We have to just be shown on balance that this is likely to have been caused by a breach of the tenancy agreement by the tenant. And if we can't say that, we can't make an award from the tenant's deposit.
I think the thing to add to that is, by process of elimination, you can get to, so we've done one recently where it wasn't quite the paint was flaking, but there's just a smell of damp in the house. But the relative humidity was great, the heating was great. And so by process of elimination, we measured, is the wall permanently damp? Is there likely to be interstitial condensation? Please forgive me if I got it completely wrong by saying that word. But is there likely to be that wall is just a damp wall and the insulation has just dropped? And in that case, we actually discovered that, yeah, the insulation, it was a cold bridge and the insulation had just dropped. So in that way, we could say, yeah, there's a problem with the wall. In other cases, it's a case of, well, I've measured the wall's fine. So maybe it's something happening outside. And sure enough, there's something happening outside. So there is things that you can do by process of elimination as well, but it does need you to be able to, I'm selling the sensors, but what our service is. But our service is about telling you what the problem is. But if it's not that problem, it's just, again, it's process of elimination and balance of probability.
Thanks, Leonard. We are leaseholders and the freeholders are a housing association and poor at responding to issues such as leaking downpipe, creating damp internally. What rules do freeholders need to follow to address the problem? So I think, Martin, you touched on that, didn't you, in the legislation as to what is required, and there are some government website. But I think the thing to do there is to just report and keep a record of the reporting of those issues. For Leonard, what do you suggest when when tenants are hanging their wet washing in a flat? We always recommend dehumidifiers. Any other suggestions?
We've worked with Green Doctor on this, but also applied the science a little bit. Because if you get the temperature and the humidity or the moisture levels right in a room and close the door, you can actually safely dry clothes in say, a bathroom. If you've ventilated that bathroom so it gets to a certain level of moisture content, because when you dry clothes, I think it's something like about 30, you add about 30% more moisture to the air. And so when you work the equations backwards, you can say, all right, given this amount of clothes, your starting position needs to be down here, 48% or 35 or sometimes 56. So, like it or not, we all dry clothes indoors. So part of what we try and do is say, if you're going to do that, these are the conditions that are going to be okay to do that. You're going to have to make sure that the temperature is this, the humidity is that, before you start, and then you should be okay. I think there are there's clothes horses where you can heat it. I think I've seen them.
Yep, there are.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sure one of the charities were working with some tenants who needed something. They're in a block of flats. They have nothing. They nowhere else to put their washing. But I think our point is, yes, you can dry clothes inside, but you've got to know the conditions and be able to then help the tenant understand what those conditions are, so that once they know what those conditions are, they do it. And I think a lot of it goes back down to habit, or not just lifestyle. It's about understanding. If you understand that, yes, I can do it in the shower room, but I need to make sure the moisture level is at this level. And even we can in the data we actually tell people, if you want to dry clothes, this is what you need to do at this level. If you understand that, people often follow it because they understand it. It's clear, it's simple, straightforward.
We have one, I think, which is for Martin. Can I do a check-in report during tenancies? I forgot to do it at the start.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? If I end up with a case and the check-in report was completed after the tenants have moved in, it's simply not reliable. I don't know what the condition and cleanliness was when the tenants moved in. They might have fully cleaned the property and they might have added new carpets for all I know. So the trick is to get that check-in done right at the start of the tenancy, immediately before the tenants move in, and then equally with the checkout, get it done right at the end after the tenants move out. If you can do the check-in report and get the tenant to agree that it's how the property was when they moved in and get that signature on the document, that might just save it. But I do think it's a bit of an uphill battle. If you've missed that opportunity, it's going to be difficult to prove that in the event of dispute.
Let's say 2 years have passed and the tenant's been in, you would have to, and the tenants did agree to do a check-in report at that particular stage, then the benchmark for the condition of the property would be at the point the check-in is done, not when the tenant moved in. So anything damage or deterioration that's been caused in that interim period from the start of the tenancy to the date of the check-in would not be, the tenant would not be accountable for. So we've got, let me just see whether I've got, some fans in modern buildings appear to be silent. Does this mean they are not working? They don't have the same switch on outside walls to turn on and off. Afraid I'm not able to answer that one. Leonard?
So you get heat recovery, they call them, small room. Anyway, we've done one in a flat, in a block of flats, where it's constantly on. I think they're called heat recovery. Someone on this call probably knows better than I do. But we actually measured, there's a renovation to a block of flats, and they had this whole heat recovery system in place. And it's always on, always changing the air, always keeping the moisture levels. And they are pretty quiet. But in that case, it was a renovation to a block of flats that was owned by a housing association. I think they put about £2.5 million in doing that renovation. There are, I'm sure there are others. It'd be great to maybe get Ventaxia or Envirovent on the next one to talk about it. But typically, to be absolutely silent, we've only come across a few, and one of them is a heat recovery one.
Lovely, thank you very much. So I think we're just out of time. We do have a few more questions, so we will do our utmost to respond to those. If, as I mentioned earlier, the slides will be available and will be uploaded to YouTube. We will also be putting in the chat, I think, or in a follow-up email, a survey, and it would be really useful to have feedback on this webinar so that we can continue with them and improve where necessary. So I'd just like to say thank you very much, Leonard. Very, very informative, and also Martin, for the webinar today. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.